Hello and welcome to the stream. My name is Daniel White. Some of you guys know me as Dansky and I'm an instructor with Envato Tuts Plus. And today we're going to be jumping into Adobe Illustrator and we're going to be mastering logo design in Adobe Illustrator. So it's going to be super awesome. I'm super excited. If you've got any questions throughout the stream, please do drop them down in the chat below and I'll try and answer as many as I can as we go through the stream. So over the next 60 minutes, which is going to be split into two sections, we're going to spend the first 30 minutes looking at all of the essential tools to use when designing logos. And the second half of that, in the second 30 minutes, we're going to be actually creating a logo, and that logo is what you can see on screen, and it's going to use a lot of the tools, tips and techniques that we'll be learning in the first half. So within 60 minutes, if you've never used Illustrator before, you will be able to create the logo that you can see on screen. So it's going to be super awesome and I can't wait to get started. So let's do that right now. So we'll put that logo to one side for a second. And we've got a separate document here. Now the first thing you're going to want to do is of course create a new document. And you can do that by going to File and down to New. And depending on your version of Illustrator, you may see a slightly different welcome screen, but essentially you've got lots of presets, or you can select a width and height for your document. So this is 1000 pixels wide and 1000 high. And to start with, I'm going to be working in the RGB color mode just because there's a lot more colors in that on-screen spectrum than CMYK, which is for print. And then just go ahead and click create and you'll have your new document with your new artboard sized at 1000 by 1000. So the first thing we're going to look at is creating basic shapes and lines in Adobe Illustrator. Now Illustrator has a number of different shape tools and we can see them over here on the left. So we've got the rectangle tool, and if you left click and hold, you get a bunch more. So we've got the rounded rectangle tool, ellipse, polygon, star, and flare tool. So the rectangle tool, you can select this and just left click and drag and create a four-sided shape. Or you can left click and hold shift and it will create a square. And you can of course use the main selection tool to adjust this shape. Or you can select everything and then just hit delete or backspace to remove it all together. And we can go and left click and hold and select another one. So the rounded rectangle tool, we can left click and drag, and as you can see it has slightly rounded corners, and we can use the direct selection tool to just pull those edges in, and we can adjust the radius of all of those corners. Or we can left click on one corner specifically just by clicking on that little circle there and adjust just that one. Cool. So we've also got the ellipse tool. So this will draw you an ellipse, as the name suggests, or an oval, which is fine, but you can also left click and hold shift and draw a perfect circle. So that's incredibly useful, holding shift to constrain that width and height. Now the polygon tool, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. You can left click anywhere on the artboard, which is something that you can do for all of these shapes, by the way. And you can set a radius, which is the size, so we can adjust that, but the important bit here is the number of sides. So we can click OK. And of course, 5 sides gives us a pentagon. And if we select the polygon tool again, left click, and we'll try 8, and click OK, we now get an octagon. So this tool is incredibly useful if you want to create things like hexagons, pentagons, or even, let's go 3 sides, triangles. So incredibly useful tool. And the same with the other tools. You know, you can left click anywhere rather than left clicking and dragging, and you can type a width and a height. And you can see I've got the lock here that constrains the width and height proportions, and I can unlink that and enter any values that I like, and it will go ahead and create that shape. And as you can see just there, by hovering over the corners, you see those double-ended arrows. You can left click and then rotate the shape. And if you hold shift, it will lock that to either a 90-degree or a 45-degree angle. Or you can let go and just rotate freely, and it will tell you the angle as well, which is incredibly helpful. Okay, now the last one on the list is probably the most interesting. We're not really going to look at the flare tool because that's something completely different altogether, but the star tool is pretty cool. If you left click and drag, it will create a star, which, okay, fine, that looks cool. But actually there's a lot more you can do with this tool. So with the star tool selected, if you left click on the artboard, you can set the radius 1, radius 2 and the number of points. Now radius 1 is the outermost point of the star and radius 2 is the innermost point. And of course we can specify the number of points. So if I change the radius 1 to 300 pixels and radius 2 to, let's say, 50, you can see our star actually looks quite different than the one we had before. Very menacing. So we'll delete that and we'll do that again. But instead of having the number of points set at 5, let's try 20. And you'll see we get something even more different. And we'll do that again, but we'll reduce the gap. So going from 300 to 50 is quite a jump, but let's change this to 200. And click OK. And you can see we get a very similar shape, but the radius 1 and radius 2 points are different. So this is quite useful if you want to create some kind of starburst shape to use within your design. And of course we've got the line tool. This is, as the name suggests, you can left click and draw a line. Fantastic. Or you can left click and again hold shift. That's a very common theme within Illustrator. So holding shift will kind of lock what you're creating or adjusting to that 45-degree or 90-degree angle. So if you want something perfectly vertical, you just left click and hold shift. You can draw your vertical line, or you can draw your horizontal line, or you can draw your 45-degree angle line. And we've got the arc tool as well. So you can left click. Similarly to the line tool, this will create a curved line instead of a straight one. And you can see you can skew this in many different ways. And hold shift and it will keep that locked. So it kind of locks that proportion. You can see the width and the height scale equally together. And effectively we're creating a quarter of a circle by doing that. So there we go. Those are the basic shapes and the line tools within Illustrator. The next one we're going to look at is the pen tool. Now this is super cool. It takes probably a little bit more learning, the pen tool, but once you've mastered it, it is incredibly useful because effectively it allows you to create any shape. So you can see the pen tool over here on the left, and you can left click, lots of left clicks, effectively creating a dot to dot. I don't know what this is, by the way. Very creative shape. Okay, so we've created a dot to dot with straight lines. We can also use the pen tool to left click and then left click and drag, and you can see that we can drag out a curve. And we can adjust this and see how that curve would look. And let go. And it automatically wants to follow that up with another curve. And it's very helpful because it shows you where this curve is going to go. So you could nicely balance it. So something like this, nicely balanced. So it flows nicely from the left edge all the way through to the right edge. And we could left click. And then we left click and drag again. However, I want to follow this up with a straight edge. I don't want it to automatically continue that curve. Well, there's a couple of ways we can do this. You can just left click or hold Alt and left click on this anchor point, and it will cut that short and then go back to a straight line. And as before, you can hold the almighty Shift key and it will draw a vertical line or a horizontal line or a 45-degree line. So you can see that there's a lot of flexibility in what you can actually create. And of course, that's incredibly helpful when creating logos, because if you need that custom shape that none of the other shape tools can really kind of do, then you can just draw it yourself. Now, another tool that we've got, if we left click and hold on the pen tool, we've got the Add Anchor Point tool. Now, as the name suggests, this will let you add an anchor point. So what's an anchor point? Well, anchor points are all of the things that we've created, and any shape created within Illustrator is made up of these anchor points. So if we select the Add Anchor Point tool, we can hover along this line. If you don't see these pink guides here, these are called Smart Guides. They're incredibly helpful, and you can turn them on at View and down to Smart Guides. So you can see it hovers along that line, and I can left click and I can add lots of different anchor points. And I'll show you in a moment how we can then manipulate those anchor points as well. And of course we can left click, and we've got the Delete Anchor Point tool. And as you guessed, it will delete anchor points. It won't actually delete the space between two anchor points, but it will delete the anchor point and then automatically connect up the remaining points. And we've got the Anchor Point tool here, which I think used to be called the Convert tool. So if we create a curved shape, and by the way, if you want to stop this kind of continuation here, you can go up to Select, down to Deselect, or just press the Escape key. So if we select this shape and then we'll go to the Anchor Point tool, we can click on this middle anchor point and it will convert that from a curve to a straight edge. Cool. So that's the pen tool. We've also got another variant of the pen tool. This is something that you'll be able to access with a slightly more recent version of Illustrator, and it's called the Curvature tool. Now, I like to think of this as a slightly more helpful, beginner-friendly version of the pen tool, because when you click, you just left click, so single left click, and it very nicely shows you that curvature on both sides of the anchor point. So rather than just kind of running up to that first anchor point, I can see how this is going to affect it. And as I bend this round, you can see it adjusts the rest of the shape to make sure that I get some really nice smooth curves. So I'm just going to create a random shape here. So you can see there, as I go to join that up, the circle next to the pen tool indicates that I will be completing the shape, but it automatically adjusts that first line I created just to make sure everything bends and flows nicely, nice and smooth. So that tool is incredibly helpful. Now the next tool that we're going to look at are probably two of the most important tools in the whole program. They are the Selection tool, so I call this the Main Selection tool, and the Direct Selection tool. So you can see these at the top. Now the darker shape, this is the Main Selection tool. Essentially, this is used to select anything in Illustrator. So if you want to go and apply any multitude of different effects, options that you've got available, it's always a good idea to select the Main Selection tool, and it will select that complete shape, and it will select all the anchor points within that shape as one object. So if you went to Copy and then Edit, Paste in Place, we now have a copy of this shape. If I wanted to group these shapes together, I would use the Main Selection tool to drag over both of them so they are both selected, go to Object, and then I can group them, I can lock them, or I can hide them. So lots of different options here. And then now they're grouped, I can move them around as one with the Main Selection tool. So what's the difference between the Main Selection tool and the Direct Selection tool? Well, the Direct Selection tool, that's the lighter one here, this is geared towards selecting specific anchor points. So you can see just by clicking anywhere along that shape, it highlights all of the anchor points, but just for that one shape, even though they're grouped together. And I can select that anchor point and we can pull that around. Now as I pull it, it does nicely try and adjust those curves, which is very helpful. But with a selected anchor point, it also selects it kind of shows these handles for nearby points as well. So you can see these little handles pop out, and I can actually adjust them. And if I hold down the Alt key, while I'm doing that, it will adjust just the one side. So you can see as I bend it, it kind of curves that round and adjusts the curve on all of the shapes. So incredibly useful, because when we come to create the logo here, later on in the course, we're going to be using the Main Selection tool and the Direct Selection tool a lot. The Direct Selection tool is probably one of the most useful tools in Illustrator. because it just, once you've drawn a custom shape with the pen tool, or even if you've just drawn a standard shape, it gives you that freedom to adjust the shape, move it all around as you like. So incredibly useful. So another example of how useful it can be is if I zoom in and I create a line. Let's just increase the weight of that. So we've got a line, and we'll just left click, hold Alt and Shift and drag that across to create a second line. Now, if I want to join these up, I can select both of them, but I want to just specifically join this anchor point here to this anchor point here. And for that, I need the direct selection tool, because what it allows me to do is drag over this point here. You can see it's now marked as selected. I can hold Shift and single left click on the other anchor point that I want to join up. And I can then go to Object, down to Path, and select Join. And it will let me join those two anchor points together. Whereas before with the main selection tool, it would select the whole line. So you can't join an entire line to an entire line. But now I've joined those points up, with the main selection tool, I can move this around as one complete line. So essentially the direct selection tool allows you to go to Object, Path, and Join up separated shapes into complete shapes. Right, those are the selection tools. Next, we're going to move on to the stroke panel. Now, for these next few sections, if you can't see any of the panels that I'm referring to, just go to Window and you'll see lots here. Now, there is lots more available than what we've got on screen here. But if you can't see anything, like the stroke panel, there it is. Just left click and it will pop up. And if you don't see all these options, don't worry, nothing's wrong with your computer. You just need to go up here and select Show Options. So you get a very simplified version, possibly by default, and you get lots more different options. And the main one that we're going to look at is the stroke weight. Now, what is a stroke? Well, effectively a stroke is an outline. So if you ever hear or see the word stroke, just think outline. So I've created a shape, and this is a square, not very interesting. But one thing we can do with these shapes in relation to strokes is we can add an outline. So you can see here in the toolbar on the left, I've got the fill, which has a red strike, which suggests that there's no fill. And if I click onto the stroke to select this, you can see that it's set to black. Now, with the stroke selected, I can increase the weight, and you'll see that it increases here. And we can even go and add a fill. And from the swatches panel, I'll just pick a default color for now. So we have a green square with a black stroke or black outline. And we can then go and adjust that even further from the stroke panel. Let's just zoom in a little bit there. And we can adjust the corner type. So we've got square at the moment. We can set this to rounded, and it will very subtly just round off those corners. Or we can select bevel join, and we get this kind of 45-degree angle effect on the corner. Now, because this is a complete shape, the cap type isn't really relevant. However, if we select the direct selection tool and we just drag over this top line here, so not on a specific anchor point, but just across that top line, hit delete or backspace, it will effectively remove the line between those two anchor points. So the anchor points still stay there, but they're not connected. This is an incomplete shape. And you can see this in outline mode by pressing Command or Control Y, and it strips away all color and will show you a bare bones wireframe of what you've created. So you can see this shape is now incomplete. And we could use the direct selection tool to connect those up again if we wanted. However, what I'd like to show you is how we can set the cap type. So at the moment it's set to butt cap, which is like a straight edge, and we can round cap, and it will round that off. Or you've got projecting cap as well, which just projects out a little bit further. And of course we've got some options down here. So we've got the last color we selected. We can add a gradient, which we'll come back to later. Or we can set this to none. So that's the white square with the red line through it. And we could set this for the stroke as well. So you need to make sure you've got the right one selected, whether it's the fill or the stroke that you're selecting, and then add the color to the appropriate part of the shape. So you can see it's gone back to a default stroke there. So we just need to go in and increase that weight. So let's just go and complete that shape again with the direct selection tool. Of course, you've got the shortcut there, Command or Control J. Okay, now this is a complete shape. We can choose where we want to align the stroke. So currently by default, it's aligned to the center. So we've got a stroke weight of, well, let's round that down to 20, just to make it simpler. So you can see the stroke appears either side of the path. Here is the path in outline mode, and the stroke appears either side. And if we set this to align stroke to inside, that's the middle option, it aligns it to the inside, keeping the same weight, or we can have it aligned to the outside. So you can align it to different parts of your shape depending on what you're going for. And also, we can have a dashed line. So just tick that little box there. That's an interesting interesting creation, but there we go. We've got a dashed line. Now, of course, that looks pretty terrible, but we can adjust this. And you can adjust how it affects the shape here. So particularly around the edges and how it spaces the dashes apart. But we can set the dash length. So we'll increase that to 20. And we can also set the gap. So we could add that at 20 as well. And that doesn't really do anything. Let's make this shape a bit bigger. And we'll decrease that gap. So you can see that as I decrease the gap, the shape is updated. So I'm just entering a new value and pressing enter. In fact, we could enter the dash as 0, and you can see that looks absolutely terrible, but something really cool that we can do now is set the cap to round cap, increase the distance, and we've created a dotted line. So the dash is set to 0 points in width, so it has no width, even though you can see a very faint hairline here. And as soon as you change that cap to round cap, it adds that rounded effect to either side, thus creating a dotted line. So a little trick there to create a dotted line. And of course, you can continue to add more dashes and gaps information, and you've got things like arrowheads, and you can add all sorts of stuff down there. And yes, so that is the stroke panel. Next, we've got the layers panel. Now, if you've used anything like Photoshop or XD, this may be familiar to you. And you can see this on the right. Remember, if you don't have the layers panel, it's up here at window and then down to layers. Now, by default, you get layer 1. And you can double click on this and give this a name of your choice. Let's think of a funky name. That's good. Tuts Plus, there we go. And you can expand the layer by clicking the arrow, and it shows you all of the elements. Now, we haven't got anything on our layer because we just deleted it. However, if I go ahead and create some shapes, it's remembered that dotted line. Brilliant. You can see that as we create more shapes, I'm just duplicating this here. It then adds these as separate layers. And we can lock those layers by clicking within this space here. So that layer is now locked, or we can hide and show by clicking the little eye icon. And we can double click in this empty space on the right, so not on the text because that will let us rename it. We'll click over here and we get some other options. So we similar options here, but we can dim the layer by a percentage. We can change the color if you like. So lots and lots of different options there. And you get a few more here as well. So new layer, new sub layer. You can duplicate layers all by clicking that 4-lined menu icon in the top right corner. Okay. Right. So that's layers. Transparency. Let's remove this dotted line. Let's go with a nice solid red fill. There we go. Okay, so we've got a solid red fill. And if I just duplicate this layer by holding Alt and dragging to create a copy, and I'll go ahead and give this another fill. Now at the moment we've got the yellow square on top of the red square. However, we can adjust the transparency. And I've got this panel over here on the right. And the transparency panel has something called opacity. Now this will determine the opacity of the shape. So as I decrease from 100%, the shape becomes gradually more see-through, and I can see through it and it shows the red underneath. In fact, it actually combines those shapes. So of course, when you merge yellow and red, you create orange, and that's exactly what's happening where these shapes overlap. Now, if I go to 0% opacity, the shape becomes invisible. It is still there, and I can still select it, and I can see it in outline mode, but with the opacity at 0, there's no color to it. So your fill, your stroke will all become invisible. So let's just bump that up. You can go for 90% or so. And you can type that in and press enter. So you get a little bit of opacity there as you blend these shapes. In fact, we could even create another one and add some more colors. And we can set different opacities. And you can see as we blend all of these shapes together, we get a whole mix of different colors. Oh, look at this, very creative. Now, something else we can also do is we can use the blending options. Now, if you use Photoshop, it's very similar to this. Let's bring that opacity back to 100 for all of them. And if I select the blue shape and change the blending mode to multiply, for example, it blends into the shapes underneath in a slightly different way to opacity. Opacity is very gradual. You can adjust the percentage and you can see the change happening in real time. These blending modes, they're definitely worth having a play with, but they all behave slightly differently and they blend different colors together in very different ways. For example, darken and multiply are very good for blending darker images onto light backgrounds, and lighten and screen, they behave very similarly, blending lighter images onto dark backgrounds. So it's definitely worth having a play with these. It's quite fun actually because you can really get some very interesting color combinations. So if I use soft light here for the green one, you can see that blends through and it gives me a whole bunch of other different shapes. So by blending all of these shapes with different blending modes, you can see they create very unpredictable color combinations. But as you become more familiar with some of the different blending modes, and you'll probably have some favorites like me as well, you can really learn to use those to take advantage of them and kind of get the desired effect that you're looking for. Cool, so that is transparency. So next we're going to move on to the Pathfinder tools and the Shape Builder tool. Now this is really cool. So the Pathfinder tools, let's create some shapes. And we'll go back to our good old red and yellow squares. Ha, classic. And if you haven't got the Pathfinder panel on the right here, just go to Window, down to Pathfinder. And this is brilliant and incredibly useful when designing logos. So let's just create 4 copies of this. So I'm just dragging, holding Alt and Shift, and I can repeat that last action by pressing Command or Control D. Twice. There we go. Fantastic. In fact, I will just do one more. Now, there's a lot of different Pathfinder options here. These all do behave slightly differently, and it's worth experimenting with them. The ones we're going to be focusing on are the shape modes here, and then this one here, the first one, divide. In my experience, using these 5 key tools within the Pathfinder options, create all the effects you would ever need to create a merge, combine, and cut out shapes. So we're going to show you that right now. So the first one, if I drag over both the red and the yellow square, go to the Pathfinder panel and select the top left one. This is Unite. And we can click that and it combines these two shapes into one shape. So if I go back and go into outline mode, remember that's Command or Control Y, you can see this is how it looks. I can select them both and unite them together or add them together, and it will combine those into one shape. And whereas before they had a question mark as the fill, because there isn't just one fill, there's multiple fills, so it can't tell you which color it is specifically. Once those are combined, it will then take the color of the shape on top and it will add that into the fill down here. Now, the next one along is called minus front, or you can think of this as subtract. And what it will do is it will take the shape that is on top and it will subtract it from the shape that is below. So the shape on top is the yellow one, so when we click that, you can see it knocks it out from the red one below, and of course that has kind of changed the path of the shape as well. And next, if we select these two here, we're going to go to the next option along. This is intersect. And if we click this, you can see the point at where the shapes intersect is retained and everything else is discarded. And for the last one, this is exclude. And of course, you guessed it, it does the exact opposite of intersect. We click that and it discards the middle where the shapes cross over and it retains everything else on the outside. Now the last one down here is divide, and the reason that I wanted to show this one specifically from the Pathfinder options is because it is incredibly useful. So I'm just going to use the pen tool to create a rather terrible shape. And we'll just give this some more color. So this is a design. Please don't take it seriously, but this is supposed to be a design. We're just merging lots of shapes together. And if I go into outline mode, you can see that these shapes overlap each other at lots of different points. And if I drag over everything and in the Pathfinder panel select divide, well, you can see nothing happens. However, it does. What it does is where these shapes all overlap, all of these paths that we're looking at here, it separates those into separate shapes. And what that allows us to do is we can use the direct selection tool to pull apart all of these individual pieces. Pretty cool, right? Or what we can do is just go to Object. If I just kind of go through that process again. So use the Divide option and then go Ungroup. And then I can use the Main Selection tool to do the same thing. So essentially, whichever tool you use, it combines these, it breaks these all apart into separate shapes. And we can pull those out. Now, the Shape Builder tool. The Shape Builder tool is slightly different. The shortcut for outline mode is Command or Control Y. Incredibly useful. So the Shape Builder tool is something that you'll be able to use if you have a more recent version of Illustrator, and it's incredible. It's a huge, huge time saver, and we'll be using that later on in the course. So if I select all of these shapes and then select the Shape Builder tool, you can see that I can mouse over all of these different elements. So where lines intersect, it creates a break, and I can essentially select each individual segment. Now, the way this is brilliant is you can left click and you'll see it starts drawing a line. It's not actually drawing a line, by the way, but I can drag into other segments, and the dotted area is marking what's going to be combined together. So if I drag through these different segments here and let go, you can see it combines all of this into one shape. And let's go back into outline mode. This is a really good way of using outline mode, because you can take out all the color and focus on actually connecting all the dots, combining all the shapes in the right way. And it's a lot easier to do it this way because there's less distraction as well. But if I wanted to remove this segment here that I've got highlighted, You can see by default there is a plus next to the arrow icon. What I can do is hold down the Alt key and that changes to a minus, and I can left click and it will knock out that part of the shape. So even though all of these were individual shapes to begin with, when you select everything and then use the shape builder tool, you can work with them and add bits in and remove bits, all as if it were one complete shape. So let's create something even more complicated, just because this tool is fantastic. And we'll add lots of color in here. Please don't judge me. This isn't the extent of my creative work, honest. There we go. We'll duplicate that holding Alt and dragging. Right. Lots and lots of circles. Looks very fun. Okay, cool. So just remember to drag over everything with the main selection tool, select the shape builder, and now we can draw a path all the way through all of the different segments. And it will combine those like so. And we could then just knock out some of these shapes. Now, another really good use of this is if you wanted to create a cloud, for example. So you can see here, I'm literally using just all the basic shapes, circles and the rectangle tool to create this shape. But of course it looks like that in outline mode. And while that's fine, we want to kind of tidy that up. It's best practice to kind of, keep your shapes, merged where they should be merged. Just keep it all tidy and everything. So we can drag over this and then use the shape builder tool to just go all the way through. And voila, we have a complete cloud. So that's just a really, really quick example. Okay, I love those tools. They are fantastic, but let's move on. So the next one is swatches, or global swatches to be more specific. Now a swatch is a color. It's just another name for a color within Illustrator, and you have the swatches panel over here on the right, and by default it loads in all of these different swatches, and we can double click one. And at the moment we're working in RGB. You can change that to CMYK or other values here, grayscale, depending on what you're looking for. And you can tick the preview box and adjust the color, and it will adjust in real time. Lots and lots of colors to choose from, or you can pick something from the color picker or enter that 6-digit hex value here if you know it, and then click OK. So with this as the current color in your toolbar, just click that new swatch icon and you can see that it adds it to the end. So you've got your new swatch. So we can go through and just double click, change lots of values, and we've created a color palette. By the way, if you do double click any shapes by mistake, you can see up here that you've kind of gone a layer into that shape. Especially if you've got more complex shapes, you can go deeper and deeper. If you do that and you end up in this mode, which is called isolation mode, it's intended for working on specific shapes in a bit more detail. You can just go back here or click the arrow to exit isolation mode altogether. So that sometimes happens. So if you double click, don't worry, you can escape from isolation mode. It's not as terrible as it sounds. Okay, so we've made an averagely terrible color palette. So no, let's add a yellow. We'll add a yellow, yellowy orange. There we go. Fantastic. So we've got a color palette there. Now, if I'm working on illustration or a logo or just something incredibly complex, which I'm going to try and very, very quickly mock up now. So imagine these are lots of different ideas, and I've decided that I want to use a certain color within my design, or I've created an incredibly complicated illustration and it's all been done in with this color palette. And I think, I really need to change the color. I don't want to go through and select every line manually. I want to do it in the most time efficient way possible. Well, what I should have done before doing all of this is created a global swatch. Because if I want to change the yellowy orange color here, I've got to go through and manually change it on every single one, which is incredibly time consuming, boring, and ultimately there's a better way of doing it. So for me personally, when I'm creating a swatch, I always create them as global swatches. I can never really think of a good reason not to, just because it gives me that extra bit of flexibility further down the line. So just select your swatch, double click, and just tick this global box. That's it, that's all you've got to do. And you'll see this little white tag kind of appears in the corner there. So we'll just make each of these 3 swatches global swatches. And we can drag these around as well. We can reorder them. And you get a few more options up here related to swatches if you need them. And of course you can delete swatches just by selecting them and hitting the delete swatch. That's the trash can symbol down the bottom right, and it removes that swatch. But these are all global swatches. So again, let's go crazy and create lots of shapes. We can use the eyedropper tool to sample that same color, and of course it will use that same swatch. So I'm just going to create some crazy shape madness as quickly as I can to try and illustrate this. We've got something a little bit Mickey Mouse going on over here. I don't know what that is. Okay, so imagine this is a fantastic illustration. What I want to do is I want to change the purple without having to go through and manually change each shape. Well, because this is a global swatch, it affects the document. And I can just double click that global swatch, select preview, and as I adjust this, it affects every instance of that color in real time. So imagine this is a complex illustration or an app design or a logo design with lots of different parts, lots of detail. You can go in and you can just change it in an instant. And then I can change the yellow, make it more orange, and then I can double click the red, tick preview, and I can make this green. And that takes seconds, whereas doing it the manual way is a lot more time consuming. Cool, so that's a little bit about swatches. Next, we're going to look at gradients. And we'll just start by selecting our good old rectangle tool. We've got a very vibrant green there. Now, gradients in Illustrator are also really awesome. We've got the gradient panel on the right, and you can find that down here. Now, first of all, you can just select the gradient slider, click anywhere on it, and it will create your default black to white gradient. And you can reverse that gradient if you like. So we'll go left to right or right to left, or you can manually adjust the angle of the gradient. And you've got lots of presets here. So you can go from top to bottom, left to right, whichever you'd like. And of course you can quickly reverse that. And you can of course swap the fill and the stroke. So that gradient, if I zoom in, you can't really see it here. If I just increase that stroke weight, the gradient is now applied to the stroke and then back to the fill. So you can quickly swap the fill and the stroke using those double-ended arrows down there. So we've got a gradient, and you can change the type from linear to radial, and it will emanate from the center towards the edges. And of course you can reverse that as well. So lots and lots of fun options. You can adjust the start point for each color as well. So if I want more black, I can drag this over to the right. And if I bring the white in from the right hand side, you can see it creates a very harsh divide. So for a softer gradient, it's always better to move these color swatches apart. Now for any gradient, you've got to have a minimum of 2 because you have to have one color that graduates into another. However, you can see by hovering along the line, I've got the plus icon and I can add more swatches. And I can then double click a swatch and pick a color. And I'll double click another swatch, pick another color. And that's another great thing about using global swatches is as I create this gradient with global swatches, again, if I go back into the swatches panel and change that global swatch, because that green is quite awful, you can see it will update it in every instance, and that includes gradients. And there we go. So we can click this again and we're back to the gradient panel. Now remember, we need a minimum of 2, so I can get rid of this black because it just doesn't really work with the vibrancy of all the other colors. So we can just click that and drag it off. And I can extend this out. And the orange one, I can now adjust the location. So you can see that down here, that percentage moves as I move it around. Let's set that to 50% just because I'm a perfectionist and it has to be right in the middle. And of course you can adjust the opacity of any swatch by selecting it and changing the opacity there. Or you can type a value in if you like. And of course, between each individual swatch, you can adjust the position, and that's a little diamond icon here. So very similar to moving the swatch itself, you can introduce a bit more of one color and a bit less of another just by adjusting the breakpoint here within the gradient. So those are those little diamonds, and of course they have their own percentages as well in relation to the swatch that are in between. So if I click 50, or if I type 50 rather and press enter, this little diamond goes in between the orange and the green swatch. Cool, so that is gradients. We're going to look at a couple of other additional tools, and then we're going to jump in to actually creating this logo. So another really useful tool that I absolutely love is the smooth tool. And you can find this down here. So depending on your version of Illustrator, it will either be under the pencil tool or the shaper tool. And you can just left click and hold and select smooth tool. By the way, shaper tool is also really useful. You can left click and drag with the shaper tool, and it will recognize what you're drawing and attempt to draw it. So if you're doing anything like wireframing, or you're just kind of conceptualizing ideas, you can use the shaper tool to very quickly draw straight lines, draw shapes. Even if you draw like an absolutely terrible one, you can see there I did a circle within a few seconds. So that's incredibly useful if you're looking to do something very quickly. Right, so the smooth tool. So let's just draw a line. Now this is very common with the pen tool, especially if you're new to the pen tool. Your lines won't look as perfect as you might like. In fact, I get this even now, you know. So this isn't a a new to Illustrator thing. I use this tool all the time now when I'm creating lines. If I create part of a logo in Illustrator and it's just not as smooth as I'd like, I can nicely smooth it out. So you can see here, we have that little kink there. It doesn't flow as smoothly as the rest of the line. However, we can left click and hold, select the smooth tool, drag over everything, and then select the smooth tool again. And all I need to do is just left click and drag over the part of the line that I want to smooth out. Now this line is all connected, which is what we need, and I can just left click and drag. You can see it's kind of showing me where I'm drawing, and I just need to go over that one segment. And you can see it smooths it out, it adjusts it, and it's added another anchor point in there. Not quite smooth though, so let's go again and again. And I'm just left clicking and dragging until it's perfectly smooth. In fact, with this tool, you can, it's often a case of trial and error. You can go out, you can do this as many times as you like. You can see as I'm smoothing this, it's changing the shape every time. And sometimes you can go too smooth, but then you've also got the undo option. So just remember Command or Control Z, and you might go smooth, smooth, undo, undo, and you can use that to very quickly get the type of curve that you like. But it's fantastic at just removing those little kinks, those little awkward curves that aren't as smooth as you'd like them. Right, we've also got the knife tool. Now this is quite literally what it says. I can select the shape, it's under the eraser tool here. We've got the knife tool, and you can use this in a very kind of freehand fashion, and you can make those slices, and what it does is it will literally slice apart your vector shapes into different segments. So that's pretty straightforward. Something else we'll just talk about briefly is the scissor tool. So if I create a circle Remember, that's selecting the ellipse tool, left clicking and holding shift. And we'll just increase that weight. And then just left click and hold where the knife tool is, select scissor tool. What I can do is I can select a point along the path and select another point over here. And then with the direct selection tool, I can now select in between those points and just hit delete. And it removes that space in between. And I could then just left click and hold shift. And we've created something like a power symbol. So another really useful tool if you're kind of looking to create gaps between lines, or you're doing icons or doing a lot of line work. So incredibly useful tool. That's the scissor tool. Right. So those are the essential tools to create logo designs within Illustrator. Let's just kind of have a look and see if we've got a few questions, and then we will jump into creating this. This is definitely going to be more than 60 minutes. Zandercorp says, is there an automated way to say separate the line from the fill as two different paths instead of it being one thing? I don't think there's a way to automatically separate it, but what you can, there's a couple of ways you can do it. You could create a shape, and what we'll do is we'll give this a stroke, give it a slightly darker color, and I'll just thicken that up. So if you really wanted to separate the stroke from the shape, something I would do is just go edit, copy, edit, paste in place with the shape selected, hold shift and use the right arrow key and just nudge it out. And then just on one shape, deselect the stroke. On the other shape, just deselect the fill. And then hold shift and use the left arrow key and nudge that back in place. Now, of course, it's on top, but I can go to Object, Arrange, and Send Backwards, and it will send it back behind it. Now, the good thing about this is these shapes are still too editable, or at least the top one is still editable in terms of width. So if I were to go Object and Expand, what it does is it turns that into just another shape. So this isn't a stroke that is now editable, it's just another shape. So at least kind of doing it that way will keep them as two editable shapes. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay, Studio JPK says, how does he make that zoom square? What is the shortcut for it? I think he's asking. Okay, so how to zoom in Illustrator. Yes, so when you become familiar with the zoom tool and the shortcut, which is Z on the keyboard, you can navigate around the document incredibly quickly. So if I just zoom back out, in fact, by the way, zooming back out, these are ones worth learning. So fit, artboard in window, and actual size are incredibly useful. So that's Command or Control 0 or Command or Control 1. So I can zoom in and then zoom out just by using those shortcut keys. And of course, if I'm zoomed out and I want to zoom in, which when doing logo work, you know, precision is a really important thing to me. I like to zoom in thousands and thousands of %, as you'll see in a moment, just so I can get absolute precision. So if I wanted to zoom in to this square, I could just press Z on the keyboard, left click and drag around the area, and it will focus in on that area that I selected. I mean, you can just use the zoom tool and just left click, left click, left click, left click, and go in that way. But I find it a lot quicker just to drag around the area that I want to focus on the artboard, and boom, it zooms in and fits that to my window. And then of course, I can go back and use those shortcut keys here. In fact, these are worth learning as well, zoom in and zoom out. And then I can use these shortcut keys to very quickly move around my document. Zandercorp says, does that merging tool exist in CS6 as well? I think it might be worth double checking. The shape builder tool, I think that was something that was introduced in Illustrator CC. It doesn't necessarily need to be the latest version, but I think Illustrator CC is where when the shape builder tool was introduced. However, everything that you can do within the shape builder tool, you can do with the Pathfinder tools. It just is a little bit of a longer process sometimes. So before, with the shape builder tool, we could draw through all of these and merge them. You can do that with the Unite option in the Pathfinder panel. Or if we wanted to, hold Alt and knock that middle bit out with the shape builder tool, again, you can do that with the exclude option. So there's lots of different ways that you can use the different tools. In fact, when we come to do the logo in a moment, what I'll do is I'll try and use a combination of the shape builder tool and the Pathfinder tools as well. So if you have a more recent version of Illustrator, the shape builder tool is a fantastic addition. But if you are on CS6 or older, you can still create loads of awesome shapes and you're not limited really in any way. It's just a little bit more convenient, that's all. Cool. Right. So those are the tools. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, so apologies, but hello, what's the easiest way to make shapes striped? Well, there's lots of different ways that you can do this in Illustrator, and I think what I'm going to do now is probably one way. So we can create a series of stripes. And we can use the alignment options to just space those out equally here. And if I open the swatches panel and just drag that into the swatch panel, it will add that as a color swatch. And then we can go and apply that fill to a shape. And as I make that shape bigger, it will just adjust the size. In fact, that was a pretty terrible attempt at stripes. Let's do this a bit better. Okay, we'll zoom in. We'll make these really long. And what we'll do, remember it's Command or Control D to repeat your last action in Illustrator. So really useful if you'd like to do something like this. And then we can drag all of these into the swatch panel and it will make an image swatch. And then we can go and add that as a fill. And it behaves a little bit differently there. Let's go and try another one. So let's copy this and rotate. So you can get really, really creative, but anything that you create within Illustrator, you can add as a swatch and then use it within other shapes. So we could add that to this. It's only really using that part. So what we can do now is we've got all of these as lines. We want to use this middle section. We don't want these bits around the edge because they're causing problems. So if we go to Object and Expand, it then converts those from editable strokes into shapes. And from the Pathfinder panel, we can unite all of that together. And then what we can do is we can go and trim off some of this excess with the Direct Selection tool. So I'm just dragging over all of these end anchor points and then hitting Delete or Backspace. You can see there, so it's a very complicated shape and it doesn't want to play nicely. Now this is something that happens a lot in Illustrator when you work with more and more complex shapes. So let's try this another way. We'll just draw a square over that center area and then just drag over both of those shapes. So we have our crazy kind of throwing star in the background and then we have our shape on top. We can go to Object, Clipping Mask and Make, and it will clip that shape to the shape on top. So the shape underneath will be clipped and cropped to that shape on top. Let's try adding this as a swatch. No, it doesn't want to play ball. It doesn't want to play ball. Okay, instead of angles, let's try something a little bit different. We'll do something a little cleaner. There we go. And we'll just duplicate that and rotate. There we go. It's a lot more simpler. If we drag this in, you can see, there we go. It fills that entire kind of swatch space. So the more complicated your shapes, when you kind of import them as a swatch, you may get different results, you know, not exactly as you'd intend. But typically, from experience, the best swatches work when they look like this, when they fill the whole swatch panel. If you do have this excess white, which I created just then, that excess white is going to be part of your fill. And of course, that was why the kind of shapes weren't working when we just created those varying shapes. However, if we select this one and apply this as a fill, you can see it adds it there. And we could even go and just trim off these edges. You see they're repeating those edges around the shape. We don't really want that. So we've trimmed off the edges. We'll add that as another swatch. It does something even weirder. So yeah, lots of fun adding swatches. That's probably one way to do it. But another way, as we just demonstrated, to make a shape striped is to not use swatches. There's so many different ways to create the same thing in Illustrator. So some work evidently better than others. If I wanted to crop this to a certain shape, what I would do is I would just use that circle. And then go Object, Group. And we'll pop this on top. It doesn't matter what color you give it. The important thing is that the shape underneath will be cropped into the shape on top. Select them both, go Clipping Mask, Make, and there we go. So it crops whatever you select underneath into that shape. So that's probably a simpler way of doing it. You can do it with swatches, and there's other ways that you can do it, but I think that's probably a way of doing it where you get a bit more control over it, because of course you can now double click and go in, and you can adjust that shape. So we can go in there and then come back out, and it's adjusted it for us. Cool. Okay, right, now we're going to move on to creating the actual logo itself. So that's the logo that you can see here. And at the moment, this is all grouped together, and I'm just going to select this, scale it down holding Shift, and just move this out of the way. I pop that over there. And we're going to start by selecting the ellipse tool. So we're going to be using all of the tools that we've just learned about, or most of them, in creating this logo. So just left click and hold Shift. And we're going to add a stroke. Let's just start with a pink. So we'll double click pink. And remember, we're going to create this as a global swatch and select OK. And let's just hold Shift and select those other swatches, and we'll drag those to the trash to remove them. Now we've got our pink stroke, and we're also going to select the line tool, left click and hold Shift to draw that vertical line, and make sure you've got your smart guides on. Go to View and down to Smart Guides, and we can nicely drag this over here, and we can snap this in place. You can see there those smart guides make it very, very easy to line these shapes up. And we can select everything by dragging over it, and from the stroke panel, increase that weight. And we'll go up to, let's go to 130, I think. Yeah, we'll stop at 130. Now, of course, now we've increased that weight, this looks a little bit short, so we need to increase that, and we can do that with the direct selection tool. So you can select that top anchor point, and you can actually use the up and down arrow keys to extend that, or just drag holding the mouse and hold Shift, and it will keep it perfectly straight and vertical. Let's increase that to, let's go for 140. So there we go. So we've got the letter D, we've got that D shape, and we can still edit that stroke at the moment. Now just make sure that you get that width correct so you're happy, because next we're going to go to Object, Expand, and leave Fill and Stroke selected, and effectively it will turn those strokes into shapes. So you can see that these now are not recognized as a stroke or an outline by Illustrator, they are a shape with a fill. And we're going to use either the Shape Builder tool or the Pathfinder tools and select Unite. And it will merge those into one shape. So it goes from looking like this to this. Dustin Hine says, this has inspired me to install Illustrator. Awesome, that is so awesome. Good work, man. Good work. Okay, so we've combined that into one complete shape. And we're going to zoom, let's just scale this down a bit. It's a little bit big at the moment. So we can scale down holding Shift and we'll keep those proportions. We don't want to skew it out of shape because that looks awful. And if you hold down Alt at the same time as Shift, it will scale your design towards the center or scale it up. So very, very handy. You can scale from a particular corner by holding Shift or hold Shift and Alt to scale from the center. And we'll come out of outline mode. Remember that's Command or Control Y, and select the ellipse tool. And we'll just left click and hold Shift to make a perfect circle. And with the direct selection tool, remember we can drag over this anchor point on the right and just hit delete or backspace, and it leaves us with a semicircle. And now what we want to do is remove the bottom half of this semicircle. And we can do that with the rectangle tool. I mean, there's lots of ways to do it, but this is just one of them. So we'll use the rectangle tool to draw a shape over the bottom half only. And you can see those smart guides nicely mark where the center is. And of course, it doesn't matter what color this shape is here. The important thing is that the shape is on top. You can see then I was changing the color, but I was changing the stroke instead. So make sure you've got either the fill or the stroke selected respectively, depending on what you're trying to change. So now I can just drag over both of them, and from the Pathfinder panel, select minus front, and it will knock out that blue shape from the pink shape, and it will leave me with this quarter segment here. And I can zoom in using the zoom tool, thousands of %, and use those smart guides to line up those edges. And then hold Shift, just so I don't skew the proportions. Seeing as I've gone to all this trouble of making this lovely quarter segment of a circle, we don't want to go and skew that out of shape by doing something like that. No, 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 no. Okay. Now it's a little bit too tall. Again, we can use the direct selection tool to drag over all of those anchor points at the top. We must make sure we select all of them so we don't skew the shape, and use either the mouse or the arrow keys to just bring that down. So we can adjust the height, again with the direct selection tool. And now we can merge all of these into one shape. And we can do that from the Pathfinder panel or by using the Shape Builder tool to select both segments. Cool, so we've effectively almost created the shape. There's just one more thing that we're going to add. At the top right corner here, we have a very kind of hard edge. I'd like to round that off slightly. Now there's a few different ways we could do this. We could do this with the pen tool. Remember we talked about this, and we could draw that curve out, and that's pretty good. Another way we could do it is select the ellipse tool, left click and hold Shift, and we're going to draw a mini circle. And we'll give this a different color so we can see what we're doing. And we'll position this. Remember, I'm zooming in really, really far here. That's Z on the keyboard to get the zoom tool up. Now the smart guides here, they're not being very helpful. They're actually making it difficult for me to line up exactly where I want. So I can just go and disable those and do this manually by eye, zooming in incredibly far. If you get the precision correct at a zoom level of something like 64,000, which is the maximum level in Illustrator, then when you zoom back out to 100%, your design work is going to look flawless. Okay. So remember, Being the perfectionist, we have to get this in the right position. So I'm just zooming in and out. Striving for perfection. Okay, so the curve, that's the important part. I want that perfectly smooth curve, and now I've got that. So with the direct selection tool, as long as I don't disrupt this curve here, I can pull this out. And I can pull this one as well. And I've still got that perfect curve. It doesn't matter what's going on with the rest of the shape here, which looks pretty crazy. As long as I've got that curve, I can then drag over everything and either use subtract from the Pathfinder panel or the shape builder tool and just hold down Alt. Remember to get that minus icon up and left click, left click, left click. And it removes all of those excess pieces, and now I've just very subtly rounded off that corner. So whether it's the pen tool or whether you use shape tools, shape builder tools, Pathfinder tools, if you want to tweak something ever so slightly, like rounding off that corner and doing it manually, you can do that, and you have that flexibility in Illustrator. Cool, right, I'm just going to use the direct selection tool to just lengthen the height of that a tiny bit. And now we're going to start creating the shadows. Now this is the really, really cool bit. So let's zoom in. And we're going to use the pen tool. So let's just switch our smart guides back on. Now you can press the cap locks key and it will turn the pen icon into a crosshair, which is helpful if you're looking to get a little bit more precision when working. And you can see those smart guides nicely marking that path for me. So thank you very much, Illustrator, for being so helpful. And I can left click exactly on that path. Now the important thing here is that we get this first curved line looking correct. And I'll show you why. I've left clicked again on that bottom point, and I'm going to try and get this curve looking nice and smooth. Let's have a look at our example. Okay, I'm just going to undo that. It's Command or Control Z. And we'll try that again. So it may take a few goes just to get it looking super, super smooth. And then once you've done that first line, what we're going to do is just click on that point to cut it. And we're just going to drag this over here. Now it doesn't matter how the rest of the shape looks. The important thing was just that first line. And I will just make this a different color so you can see what I'm doing. So that's going to be where our first gradient's going to go. And the second one is even easier. We can use the pen tool. You can see it snaps to those points really nicely. And we just have to cover the area. So it looks like this in outline mode. That's Command or Control Y. And you can see the wireframe of your shapes. Now this is where the shape builder tool can save you a little bit of time. You can drag over this, and from the Pathfinder panel select divide, and then use the direct selection tool to delete all of those extra segments. And that's absolutely fine, there's nothing wrong with that. A slightly quicker way of doing it with the shape builder tool is to select it, hold Alt, and you just left click on the points that you'd like to get rid of, and it just leaves you those shapes. So both do exactly the same thing. One, as I say, is just a little bit more time efficient. So this looks fine, looks like a piece of candy or something. So we've got these colors. What we're going to do is we're going to select, well, we're going to create some swatches, because at the moment we've got the pink color and we want to add some shadowing in there. So you can see we've got the darker color on the inside, and then it fades out and blends with the rest of the shape. So first of all, let's go and create those swatches. So with nothing selected, we've got our pink here, and we can select this one here, color guide, and you can see it automatically populates some darker and some lighter. The lighter ones work with the global swatch, but if we take our existing color here and we'll go a couple of shades darker, just click that. You might have to click it once or twice. Make sure that it is selected here in the toolbar on the left, and then just go back to the swatch panel, add it as a new swatch, and just tick that global button. And we'll bring that up here alongside it. And again, we're going to select the original pink magenta color, and we're going to go a few shades lighter. So again, make sure that that is selected in your toolbar, and then create a new swatch. So we've got our darker color, our middle color, and our lighter color. And we can select, well, let's start with the bottom. We can select this part of the shape here. Open up the gradient slider and just click anywhere, and we get that default black to white gradient. Now what we're going to do is just swap that around by clicking reverse gradient, and we can double click on the black and select our darker color. And then we can double click on the white and select our original pink color, which is what the rest of the logo is. So it's going to blend nice and seamlessly from the darker color into that color. Almost. So you can see there, you may, depending on the colors you're using in your shape, you may get some banding appearing. That's okay. What you can do is select this shape and go back to the gradient panel and just bring that slider to the right, to the left a little bit. So just bring it in like so. And you can see that that banding disappears, and it just creates a much more seamless transition. Of course, you can adjust this to the extreme, so you can have that shadow tucked up right in the corner, or you can have it a bit more a bit further out. And you can even use the gradient tool over here to quickly and easily adjust your gradient. So we could rotate the angle, for example, and we could adjust that using the gradient tool live on the actual shape itself. So we can move that around. So you can see there, perfectly smooth transition. And now we've created one gradient. This is the easiest part in the world. We select our yellow shape, we select our eyedropper tool, we sample our gradient, and then we just hit reverse. Unfortunately, because of these shapes, they kind of work the other way around, but you could even type in an angle here if you wanted, and adjust that way, or you could use the gradient tool itself from the left and you could just move the angle around. So two different ways of doing the same thing. Let's just see, so I can adjust that gradient bend there a little bit. You can see it's not as smooth as I might have liked it to be. So I can go back in with the direct selection tool and just adjust those handles just to try and get it that little bit smoother. Cool. Okay, so we've created the logo, we've applied the gradients, and we've got the angles of the gradients all working nicely. The next thing we're going to do is actually change the color. Now again, going back to global swatches, this is awesome because we don't have to go and recreate these gradients. We don't have to go back in and re-add any color. In fact, I will just add the highlight. So we're just going to add a slight highlight up here. That was the reason for creating the lighter swatch. This is really easy. We just use the pen tool to draw over this top bit, and then use the shape builder tool or the pathfinder tools to remove it, and it leaves us with this top section. And of course we can go back into the gradient slider and adjust that angle, reverse it quickly, double click the darker swatch, select the lighter one, and we've created a highlight. And that's fine. We could go in and adjust the swatch if we like. We'll do that in a moment. But we could also just select this, and from the transparency panel, just bring that opacity down. So we could bring that down to, let's say, 60. Just so it's a little bit more subtle. And we could even use the direct selection tool to drag these bottom anchor points down. So that's the shape, that's our gradient there. And it will extend down a little bit further. So when you combine all of these tools together, there's lots of different ways of doing the same thing. Now, if we wanted to change the color of this from pink to blue or any other color, because we created these as global swatches, we can go back in, we can double click on the pink, select preview, and as we adjust it, it will adjust the color. Now, for some reason in Illustrator, when you go into the color guide, the lighter colors, you can see they're marked as global swatches and the darker ones aren't, but that's not really an issue. So as we change this color, the highlights will change as well, which is quite handy. So let's go and pick a blue color, something nice and vibrant. So you can see there it's left behind the the darker pink color, but that's fine. We can double click that swatch, select preview, and we just adjust those sliders. And we just aim for a darker shade of blue. So this is really, really quick and easy to do. Just make sure you get the same kind of tone. You know, if you kind of go too green here, it's going to look a bit out of place. But essentially by dragging the sliders to the left, it makes your colors darker, and to the right makes them lighter. And there we go. We've got all of those gradients still fully editable, so we can go in, we can fine tune that gradient until we're happy. Now at the moment this is still in RGB. You can go to File, Document Color Mode, and it's RGB. That's for on-screen design. If you're doing something for print, you can turn this to CMYK. Of course, the CMYK print palette isn't as diverse as what you can display on screen. However, we can go back into these swatches, and you can see it's automatically changed that selection from RGB to CMYK, and we've got these decimal places added. You can't really have that for print, but we can just go and round those up and then just click OK. And of course do that with the other ones. So just round up or round down consistently all of these with a CMYK color mode, and it will then make sure that your design is suitable for print. Okay, and then at the end actually we can go object and group with everything selected and group it together, so we can scale it, we can move it around, you can use it as part of a design. Whatever you'd like to do with the logo, it's now going to move around as one object. So there might be different uses. You might be doing a logo for print, you might be doing it for a website, or for a little kind of favicon icon in the header. So let's remove our original here. So once you've got your logo and you're totally happy with it, you can then export it, and you can adjust the artboard using the artboard tool from the toolbar on the left. And you can do this manually just by dragging. Or you can click the artboard options icon and we can specify a specific width and height. And click OK. And then we can just scale this down. Remember, holding Shift so we don't, mess up the proportions. So you can see that looks the same. If I go actual size, which is, Command or Control 1, that is the actual size of it. And we can scale this up. Now, if I want it to go in the center, we can use the alignment options as well. You see this option here, you can align to the selection, which is 2 or multiple shapes, or you can align to the artboard. So I now know that that is in the center of the artboard. I know it looks a bit off center because of the design, but it technically is in the center. The space left and right, top and bottom is all equal at either end. And then what I might do is select the artboard tool and just drag this across holding Alt and Shift. Now remember that that creates a copy of whatever's selected, and I could then go and scale this down, set this to a different size. So this might be for a totally different use. Just drag that on there, align to artboard, and position it in the center. So using the artboard tool allows you to adjust, resize, and even go and create new artboards. And you can have a whole variety of different sizes. So if you were doing some stationery, for example, you might have your logo on one artboard, a letterhead, a compliment slip, a business card, an envelope design, and you can create these on all different artboards within the same document. And then you can just quickly move between all of the bits of stationery and add your logo as you like. And you've got color palettes as well. You've got global colors across an entire stationery kit. So if the client says change red to blue, you can do it in an instant. Incredibly handy. And the last step really is to export these. So once you've set up your artboards, you can go to File, down to Export. You've got a few different options here. This is the Save for Web, the legacy version. That's a little bit older. You've got Export As, which is quite straightforward. You can select your formats and choose your artboards, or choose a specific range of artboards. So I've got 1 to 2 at the moment. I could change that to just export artboard 2. And if you don't know what the number is, you can see the number by selecting the artboard tool. It kind of takes you into this artboard edit mode, and you can even view them from the panel on the right. So you can even double click these and give them a name to go alongside their number. And we can also go to export for screens. Now this is especially useful whether you're doing design for print, whether it's, or not print so much, but whether you're doing kind of logo design or design for web. You know, so many different uses for this. You can again select the range. You can tick what you'd like to export for artboards, or if you have any assets created. You can choose where you'd like to save them, and then you can add multiple formats. So you've got iOS and Android presets. You've got even more options here to do with the type of settings for each of these different formats. And you can export it in multiple formats as well, which is incredibly useful for saving time. And you can have the prefix, which is what starts at the beginning of the file name. So if it's a logo, it might be for web use. I need an SVG format. I need a PNG at ×1. I'll add another one. I need PNG at ×2, add another one, and it automatically knows what I'm doing, so it adds a ×3 as well. I'd like to also have a JPEG format. So if you've done a logo for a client and they're like, okay, can you give me all the final files? You can then go through and just quickly export all of this stuff. So you set all of your different options here. You can, of course, obviously remove these by clicking on the X. And once you've set the location, let's just go and create a folder. And we'll call this Assets. Just make sure that we go and select that folder. We've got all our settings done. We've got both our 2 different artboards. Click Export, and it will export all of that, and you can see it here. And of course, when you name your artboards, the file name of the artboard will appear there as well. So file name at the beginning, that was the prefix that you can also set to what you like. And then you've got your artboard name, and then you've got the size that it exports at. So if you do a logo design, when you've finished and your client has approved the work and they are totally happy, you can essentially use this to give them a full suite of logo designs, like a whole kit of the final design in different colors, in CMYK format, RGB format. You can set it all up within Illustrator and then export all of those formats literally within a few clicks, and then you have an entire pack that you can give to them with the final design. Cool. So that about wraps up the stream. I've had an awesome time. I hope you guys have found this useful and you've enjoyed kind of learning about how to master logo design. These are all of the essential tools that I use when I'm creating my logo designs. And even though each individual use of the tool has its own specific thing that it can be used for, a lot of which we've looked at today, when you combine all of these different tools with all of the different things that you can do, actually the possibilities to what you can create kind of become somewhat limitless. And you can by learning all of these different tools, anything that you think of in your mind or that you create on a sketch with pencil and paper, whatever it is, you've then got the tools that empower you to actually create that digitally within Adobe Illustrator. Cool. Oh, it's been absolutely fantastic, guys. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next stream. Okay, take care. Bye for now.